McGill Department of Medicine Grand Rounds. Thank you for attending. Before we go further, I'd like to acknowledge that McGill University is situated on the unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka and is located on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations. One of the silver linings of the pandemic has been our growing familiarity and ease with virtual meeting tools like Zoom, allowing us to gather across the McGill Department of Medicine and our 3 affiliated sites and more without slogging through rain, sleet, and snow. And really this has led to this opportunity to create these McGill-wide medical grand rounds to bring us together regularly. And the plan is to bring us together at least 5 times in the next year and then sort of take it from there. And on these special occasions, we'd like, and we've lined up world-class speakers speaking on topics of broad and significant interest. And I'd like to thank and highlight the work done by our Associate Chair of Education, Dr. Chen Tourneau, for organizing these rounds and lining up great speakers over the course of this year, including Dr. David Naylor, the former president of the University of Toronto and Dean of the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Toronto, and who's a key influencer in science and medicine in Canada. Dr. Yoshua Bengio, a world leader in artificial intelligence and the founder of Mila in Montreal, and Dr. Kaveh Shojania, an influential author on patient safety and quality. And we're thrilled that our inaugural McGill Department of Medicine Grand Round speaker is Dr. Professor Cindy Blackstock, who will be talking to us today about equity in culture and healthy kids equals healthy kids. And especially given the occasion of McGill's 10th annual Indigenous Awareness Week and the day prior to September 30th, the new National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. So I'm going to turn the virtual podium over to Dr. Romina Pache, an assistant professor in the department in the Division of General Internal Medicine and a clinician scientist focused on delivering care in the Cree and Nunavut territories and focused on high impact clinical research in partnership with our northern communities. Dr. Pache, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Roger. So it's my honor and pleasure to present to you guys Professor Cindy Blackstock. So she is a member of the Gitxsan First Nation and is honored to serve as an executive director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society. She's also a professor at McGill University's School of Social Work. She has over 30 years of experience working in child welfare and Indigenous children's rights. She has published more than 75 articles on the topics relating to reconciliation, Indigenous theory, First Nations child welfare, and human rights. Professor Blackstock was honored to work with her First Nations colleagues on a successful human rights challenge to Canada's inequitable provision of child and family services and its failure to implement Jordan's principle. This hard-fought litigation has resulted in hundreds of thousands of services being provided to First Nations children, youth, and families. She recently served on the Pan American Health Commission on Health Equity and Inequity, and fundamentally believes that culturally based equity is fundamental to meaningful reconciliation. Cindy is frequently cited in the company of the Caring Society's Reconciliation Ambassador, Spirit Bear, engaging children in meaningful actions to implement the TRC's calls to action. So I'm sure everybody's been waiting, and she'll discuss more of this in her talk on equity and culture equals healthy kids.
Thank you very much. It's a real honor to join you from unceded Algonquin territory here in Ottawa. I want to begin by really honoring all of the children who attended residential schools and those who were lost there. Tomorrow is a day when we learn about their experiences and that we use that learning to end the injustices that are continuing to happen to their grandchildren. I also want to say that I have no conflicts of interest other than I am the director of the Caring Society and a professor at McGill University. So with that, I want to spend some time talking about what have we learned from residential schools, if anything, and also what has the government of Canada learned from residential schools, if anything, and how does that impact on particularly First Nations children. I'll be spending some time talking about First Nations children because the type of discrimination that they experience is different than the types of discriminations experienced by Inuit or Métis children. So it's important that we kind of unpack that. Many of you in June remember Chief Casimir of the Tk'emlúps Secwépemc First Nation standing in front of the world and talking about the 215 children in unmarked graves in the Kamloops Indian Residential School. Many of the survivors during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had talked about those children in those graves. They knew that they were there because some of them had to dig the graves for those children. And yet, as they told their stories through their tears, they wondered if anyone really believed them. Some of us did, but some of us found it so confronting that we turned the other way. These survivors told those truths, as painful as they were, because they did not want to see the injustices happening to their grandchildren. What some of you may not be aware of is that the federal government funds public services for First Nations children on reserve and in the Yukon. They also fund healthcare for status First Nations children off reserve. Now, what the heck does status mean? Well, that racist Indian Act that pushed those kids into residential schools is still on the books. The government of Canada still decides who is a quote status Indian and who is not. And they only will provide services to quote status Indians based on blood quantum. If this reminds you of the apartheid system in South Africa, it ought to, because it was actually the Canadian government Status and Indian Act system that inspired those cards. They sent a delegation of apartheid activists up here from South Africa in the 1940s to look at what they thought was a best practice by the Canadian government and take it back. Now, these inequalities are cross-cutting. Everything from water, sanitation systems, healthcare, recreation, culture, and language. And they have existed since Confederation. And in 2016, we had a legal decision that found this to be racially discriminatory and ordered the government to stop, but it did not stop. And this is a headline about the federal government taking two of those orders, finding the Canadian government to be discriminating against the kids right now on our watch, to court under a judicial review to the Federal Court of Canada. Thankfully, we got good news on that today, but I'll get to that in a minute. But I want you to look at what Canada is doing in both of these instances. Here is the headline from the Ottawa Evening Citizen newspaper. It's dated November 15th, 1907. They're reporting on the findings of the Government of Canada's Chief Medical Health Inspector, a physician and public health specialist known as Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce. Dr. Bryce was actually world-renowned. He was president of the American Public Health Association and founder of the Canadian Public Health Association. So he had a lot of knowledge about public health. And in fact, he wrote Ontario's first health code, which was replicated across many provinces and territories, and indeed in many United States because of his position at the American Public Health Association. He was sent out to look at the health of these kids in residential schools. And what he found is that the people in Ottawa were getting 3 times the amount of healthcare funding than all, quote, Indians across the whole country. That inequality in healthcare, along with terrible health practices in the schools, they were putting sick kids with TB in with healthy kids. There was poor ventilation. The children were malnourished. There was overcrowding. All the conditions that the Ottawa Evening Citizen reported created what they call a veritable hotbed for disease, was resulting in death rates at the schools of 25% per year, or 50% over 3 years. The editors of the newspapers, finding out about this, put it on the front page of the news. It was national news back in 1907. You can see it there. Absolute inattention to the bare necessities of health. Startling death rolls revealed. This tells us that not only did people of the period back then know better, they thought it was terrible what was going on. The public reading the paper was also alarmed. This is a quote from one of the lawyers who was later a judge, Samuel Hume Blake. He says that in the Canada fails to obviate the preventable causes of death, it brings itself into unpleasant nearness with manslaughter. So people back then knew that Canada's behavior was not only immoral, it was quite possibly criminal. Here's the guy, Dr. Bryce. And you can see on the timeline a bit of his history. When his report was leaked to the media, it was leaked to the media because Dr. Bryce was told no by the Canadian government. The cost of his reforms was about $10,000 to $15,000 back then. The Canadian government's budget was about $100 million. So it was really a drop in a bucket to save these kids. Government said no, the report gets leaked. And so what does the government do? They retaliate against Dr. Bryce. They cut his funding for collecting the death statistics of the kids. Think about how useful that would be now to know who the children are in the unmarked graves. They denied him positions for which he was eminently qualified. You see, he took up this position in Indian Affairs with hopes of becoming Canada's first chief medical health officer. And he was certainly qualified for that. But after this got leaked to the media, no way, Canada wasn't having him in that position. And they promoted somebody else who was far less qualified. They erased him from Canadian history. They made sure no medical students ever learned about him, let alone people in the public. And, they also tried to disparage his reputation. They weren't very effective in that, given his stature in the public health field. But nonetheless, they were relentless. He dies and is buried in Beechwood Cemetery and forgotten from Canadian history for over 100 years. Now, what about the guy who said no? This guy might be more familiar to you. If you think back to your high school or college level Canadian literature courses, this is Duncan Campbell Scott, Confederate poet. I first met him in my high school class, and I thought his poetry sucked. And I knew it was pretty racist, but no one told us what his day job was. And his day job was being the chief bureaucrat on the Indian Affairs file. He was hired by John A. Macdonald directly. And in an interesting anecdote, he actually wanted to become a medical professional like all of you, but his family couldn't afford it. So he ended up being hired on at Indian Affairs. Now, he's the guy who received Dr. Bryce's report, and he's the guy who said no. But Dr. Bryce did not stop when Scott stonewalled him. He actually wrote to Prime Minister Laurier directly, appealing to Prime Minister Laurier to step in and save the children's lives. And Prime Minister Laurier chose not to do it. We've been hearing some conversation, particularly after the report release of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, but also recently, that there's some controversy about calling what happened to these children genocide. Some people say that no, this was not genocide. These schools, as bad as they were simply meant to assimilate children. But the problem is there's some documents that really challenge that kind of belief. And one of them is a letter sent by Duncan Campbell Scott in 1910 to one of his colleagues in British Columbia. He writes in that letter that he knows that the children are dying in the schools at far higher levels than in their villages. But this alone does not justify a change in the departmental policy, which is geared towards the final solution of the Indian problem. So there we have Duncan Campbell Scott knowing these kids are dying. He knows it could be prevented, but he's choosing not to do anything about it because he has a bigger goal of clearing out the land for settlement by the new immigrants that were coming over from Europe at that time. There are other documents too, and one of the things that Scott goes on to do is he doubles down on this residential school stuff. In 1920, he forces through the Indian Act the mandatory attendance of children, and so the overcrowding issue that Bryce noted in 1907, of course, becomes worse. In 1922, he's actually serving Duncan Campbell Scott as the president of the Royal Society of Canada. And if you read the annual report for the Royal Society of Canada, there's no mention about another report authored by Dr. Bryce called A National Crime, detailing all of Dr. Bryce's efforts to get Scott to save the kids' lives. No mention at all. Duncan Campbell Scott goes on to win a couple of honorary degrees for his poetry, and he also, upon retirement, is the beneficiary of a very large reception hosted by the Government of Canada for his loyal public service. For his moral cowardice and his wrongdoing, he actually got rewarded, whereas Dr. Bryce got persecuted. We know from Dr. Bryce's family that the greatest lament he had was that the work did not get done, is the way that he would phrase it. He died feeling he was a failure because he was a doctor and he knew how to save these kids' lives. And it was heartbreaking to him that he was not successful in doing that. So let's fast forward a few years. And what you're going to find if you take a close look at residential schools and the documents is that there are whistleblowers from all walks of life coming up regularly to Ottawa and blowing the whistle. For example, there were 3 young boys who ran away from a residential school where there was severe physical abuse, and some hunters came across their bodies. They reported it to the law enforcement authorities, and that got to the Government of Canada. The Government of Canada's solution to that problem was give the kids wildlife training services, survival training, while they did nothing about the abuse. This is just a regular ongoing buzz in the way that Canada responded. In 1958, and I just want to remember, in preparation for tomorrow, remind all of you joining us that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children were more likely to die in residential schools than a soldier was in the Second World War. And these were children. That we're not talking about the children who were abused here. These are just the ones who died. So coming out of the World War, we have this former Indian Affairs employee, Jerry Gamble, who was fired from the department because he was working too closely with the, quote, Indians. And so he presents at a human rights conference in Tobic First Nation in New Brunswick. And he talks about the Government of Canada's main strategies for violating First Nations human rights. The first one is that it's the be patient speech. You've heard it. First Nations need to be patient about the water thing. I mean, we can't create change overnight. We've done more than any government ever has before. This is a complicated issue. And of course, we need to talk to First Nations. Now, what this does is it assumes a couple of things. One is that somehow this incremental equality is okay for First Nations when, and I find it so interesting when they call things like getting clean water reconciliation. That is not reconciliation. We don't say to the people in Toronto that you're beneficiaries of reconciliation because you get to turn on a tap and get clean water. That's a basic human right. So there's an acceptance of this incremental equality in those kinds of statements. There's also this suggestion that there aren't solutions on the books. And when you unpack a lot of these contemporary problems, you're going to find report after report after report documenting the same issues and same solutions. In fact, Bryce's pointing out of the inequalities is linked to the case for First Nations kids today. Had they listened to Dr. Bryce, there would be no need for the litigation that we've been involved in for 14 years. The other is, a couple of others, just make him believe that what you're doing is good for him. You just need to be the beneficiary of all the good stuff we have to offer. And that's where we call you status Indians, to make you feel like you're getting perks by being a ward of the crown and having these racial identity cards identified to you. Having channels for redress that are so bureaucratic that you never get through there. And, then the final one, and I hear a lot of this is from politicians. Oh, we're working so hard for you. You don't appreciate anything that we're doing. That kind of narrative is really in the colonial narrative, is why should we be appreciative for any level of discrimination against First Nations children or families? Why should anyone be grateful to the government for that? And one of the things I realized during COVID-19 is the government was spraying money everywhere. I didn't even know they had this amount of money. So it was clearly always possible for them to remedy these inequalities. They were just simply choosing not to do it. So we're going to fast forward to today. We know from the Canadian Incident Study results that, and a shout out here to Dr. Nico Trocme from, of course, our school social work at McGill, and also Dr. Fallon at the University of Toronto for the Canadian Incident Study. This data was just released, that First Nations children are 14 times more likely to be in foster care, again, separated from their families and other kids. Why? Poverty, poor housing, parental substance abuse linked to multi-generational trauma and domestic violence. All of these things are made very much worse by inequitable services. You can imagine you're dealing with the hardship of trauma and then you're getting less than everybody else, and yet often because of the propaganda in the Canadian society, judged as if you get more. So this is where the equity work really comes in. I mean, you are all scientists. I'm preaching to the choir here. You know that the greater the inequalities in any society, that those people who are being treated unequally are much more prone to poor life outcomes than everyone else. Everything from coronary disease to overrepresentation in child welfare, overrepresentation amongst persons with mental health challenges. The remedy is the same, is close up those inequalities. And particularly when we have a regime like this one, where we have apartheid public services, where by just being First Nations, you get less. I also point to this model, which was, this study was headed by Sir Michael Marmot, who of course is known to many of you as a worldwide expert in health equity. What we did is focus on persons of Afro descent and Indigenous peoples. And we took a stab at really rethinking the determinants of health from those two viewpoints. And what we notice is there's a lot of stuff left out. For example, the land is not a determinant of health, but it ought to be a determinant of health. And you see their land, and if you can get a glimpse of the slide, you'll see climate change listed separately. The reason for that is that climate change is really a Western concept. It's looking at the environment only to the degree it's a threat to humanity. Whereas for Indigenous peoples, we're of the land, right? We're a part of it. It's a total different conception. So there's this conceptual model for you to look at in this PAHO report. It's available in French, it's available in Spanish, and it's available in English at paho.org. I have been on the line with the press, which I'll get to you in a minute about why that's my voice is so. The last residential school closed in 1996 in Canada. For those of you who want to spend some time tomorrow learning about residential schools, I really recommend you watch a film called We Were Children. It's available, just Google it, you'll find it. This tells the story of two children who were in residential schools just as they closed. One of them in Gordon Residential School, the last residential school to close in Saskatchewan. Those survivors had to litigate against the Canadian government to try and get compensation and a class action. As a result of the class action, they had to have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action are the survivors' work plan for the country. Included in there is important work for medical professionals to do. We all noted that yesterday was the 1-year anniversary of the passing of Joyce Echiquan in Joliet Hospital, where the last thing she heard were racist comments by nurses. There's a call for Joyce's principal to come out of that. And that's one of the actions that you could take tomorrow too, is writing to Premier Legault and letting him know that you expect him to adopt Joyce's principle. You do that as an individual professional, but you can also do that as a collective. When you read the calls to action, what you're going to see is the survivors put the children, their grandchildren first. They told those truths so their grandchildren didn't have to suffer anymore. So equity and child welfare is a top call to action. Jordan's principle, which is about ensuring First Nations kids get help they need under public services free of discrimination, is the third call to action. And the number 6 call to action is education for First Nations students in ways that make them feel proud, and Métis and Inuit students, and also education for non-Indigenous folks, right? And so that's why those are all the top calls to action. So let's look at this equity and child welfare business. So we have the wave coming out of residential schools. And literally, children were just literally, the schools were shut down and there was no support for children and families, right? You're just left to your own to kind of deal with this in the midst of a public who didn't want to talk about it. And so it's no surprise that in those circumstances and with inequitable services, families really struggled. So what we know is that there are more First Nations kids in care today than there were in residential schools at their height, separated from their families due to the reasons we described. The Assembly of First Nations and a Caring Society brought a legal action under the Canadian Human Rights Act in 2007, 100 years exactly from Bryce's 1907 report, alleging that Canada's failure to fund child and family services, and particularly family support services, and its failure to uphold Jordan's principle amounted to racial discrimination. Canada reacted immediately. It cut all the funding to the Caring Society. We're still the only national Indigenous organization that doesn't get a penny from the feds. And they also began to argue this case on spurious technical grounds. It would take 9 years for the case to get to trial. And when it did, we finally got the decision from the tribunal after 72 days of hearings, over 25 witnesses, over 500 documents, clearly laid out that Canada was indeed racially discriminating against these kids. If you were First Nations, you got less of everything. The tribunal ordered Canada to stop. Now, we thought this was good news in 2016 because just in 2015, we had the Prime Minister adopt all the calls to action, and child welfare and Jordan's principle were amongst the top ones. They paraded out a bunch of ministers to say, we welcome the decision. The headlines died, and then they didn't comply. We are now at 20 non-compliance orders against the Canadian government. This is actually creating a whole new pool area of law, because the Canadian Human Rights Act has never had such a non-compliant offender of the act. Usually when they make an order saying that you have to stop discriminating, people and organizations comply. But the Canadian government has been incalcitrant. And in fact, one of those orders that was not appealed linked Canada's failure to comply with the 2016 order with the deaths of at least 3 children. And what happened there is that a community in Northern Ontario received word that children in their community had created a suicide pact. The community immediately made a request under Jordan's principle for mental health services. It sat on somebody in Health Canada's desk. They didn't do anything. And months later, 3 12-year-old girls die of suicide. This makes national headlines. The federal government says in response, well, yes, we did receive that mental health proposal, but it came at an awkward time in the funding cycle. So it was only due to that press blow up that they eventually funded the mental health services, albeit far too late for those 3 young girls. And then we find, we get into 2021 and we have the discovery of the graves in Kamloops. The federal government was ordered just months before to do a couple of things. One is compensate the victims of the discrimination to a value of $40,000 for human rights damages. The second is make sure that First Nations kids off reserve who are recognized by their nations but don't have that racist Indian Act status get help under Jordan's Principle. Canada appealed both of those decisions to the federal court. Now, the hearing was in the 3rd week of June. So in the wake of all of the public outcry and concern following Kamloops and Cowessess First Nation, the deaths of the children and the discovery of their graves, Parliament passes a unanimous motion asking them to stop litigating against these kids. The Prime Minister and his cabinet abstain. And the following week, they go to court to litigate against these kids. Today, we got the judgment, and the federal court has dismissed both of Canada's appeals. It rejected every single argument that Canada put forward and ordered the Canadian government to observe those tribunal orders. This is a good news day for kids, and it's good for the survivors of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because these are the top calls to action. But we fully expect Canada will appeal this decision. And that's where you come in. You can make sure that you can call your elected official tomorrow, send them a tweet, do whatever, and say, observe these orders, comply with the law, and don't appeal. So let's get into Jordan's Principle, something that is really important to your practice as medical professionals. Jordan's Principle is named after Jordan River Anderson of Norway House Cree Nation. It really means that First Nations children should get access to health, education, and social supports free of any discrimination. But it even goes further than that. It recognizes that because First Nations kids have been shortchanged for so long, they actually need more services than other children may need to get to the same outcome. So it's a substantive equality provision. All it requires is a healthcare professional to write a note saying this is the child's needs and this is the service, product, or support required to meet that need, plus the guardian's consent. And you can call these numbers and make a Jordan's Principle request. Now you can do this 24 hours around the clock. So say, for example, you're in an emergency and a First Nations child comes in who needs urgent mental health supports. You can get a hold of this number and ask that this case be addressed urgently. Use those words, urgently. And within 12 hours, the federal government's obligated to get back to you to fund that support for that child in the family. Could be respite support, could be mental health supports, and other things. So take a note of these 24-hour lines. And here's just, I want you to be really creative in what you prescribe. You know, my friend and pediatrician Sue Bennett talks a lot about social prescriptions, right? That you guys are out there interacting with children, young people, you know what they need. So all it requires is you and your good judgment as a professional interacting with children and families to say what that child needs and what they deserve. Don't self-screen and say, well, they'll never fund that. I'll give you a couple of examples. We had a little boy and he was 4 years old and he had autism. And the way it manifested for him is he got fixated on spinning circles. Unfortunately, his home directly faced on a major roadway. So you can see the danger there, right? He would be running after the moving vehicles. And because of that, the child could never go outside and play. So the request goes into Jordan's Principle to build a 7-foot fence so he can go outside and play and, you know, develop a kind of a healthy, happy childhood. That was paid for Jordan's Principle. We've had homes renovated for children, for example, who have gone into accidents and required wheelchairs. We've had learning assistance provided. We've had respite provided. We've had cultural services provided under Jordan's Principle. All of these things are possible under Jordan's Principle. So if you feel that child has a need, the key is ask for it. Just send that note into Jordan's Principle and get it done. I should say one of the very, very positive things that happened with Jordan's Principle is because we got this legal finding, and because the federal government funds healthcare for both First Nations and Inuit, Jordan's Principle also applies to Inuit children. And I know you see a lot of Inuit families in Montreal. So this is another venue to get the needs of Inuit children and youth met as well. So keep it in mind. We've also had things, for example, for children with learning disabilities, or sometimes kids with cerebral cystic fibrosis, to get iPads and computers so that they could learn virtually in their classroom, or percussion vests, all that kind of stuff that's really necessary for kids is available through Jordan's Principle. And in Jordan's name, and thanks to that litigation, and over 1 million services have now been given to these kids that they otherwise would have been denied. And to give you a sense of how bad the denials were before, the federal government, for example, would cap things like feeding tubes. So they'd say to First Nations families, you've gone through your quota, so you're either going to have to rewash that feeding tube or not feed your kid. Like, that's how ridiculous this whole thing was, right? So Jordan's Principle is an antidote to that. I'm just looking at my time. I don't want to go too much over here. So we've created animations for children to talk about Jordan's Principle, and we've actually had children do public service announcements in American Sign Language, French, and English. So go onto our website, jordansprinciple.ca. These are great. You can share them around with your clients, but also share them around with your colleagues. We're working on remedying the discrimination, and what we're doing with the funding is we're not asking how much does it cost for child welfare. We're saying how much does it cost for First Nations children to thrive. And inspired by the work of PAHO, we've gone out to First Nations communities and asked them to identify the well-being indicators for children, families, and communities, and to drive the funding towards that. If you want to learn more, go to the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy and see how this funding envelope is going to work. I'd love to see that kind of outcomes-based kind of funding process used far more frequently. Young people have a lot to say about why we keep ignoring these lessons from the past. Why is it, they ask, that we're not implementing the solutions that are already on the books, like ending these inequalities or the TRC's calls to action? We work with a group called Assembly of Seven Generations. They're First Nations, Métis, and Inuit young people's group, and they've done a whole book on accountability, how professionals like you should be accountable to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit young people, how I should be accountable to them, how the government should be accountable. And the number one thing they say is act on the recommendations that come out of these reports. We have a plan to get rid of all the inequalities. You know, government has been doing it drop by drop, program by program for 154 years. First Nations kids are still not worth the money. We're still having to fight in court. So we have something called the Spirit Bear Plan. It's endorsed by all First Nations across Canada. It's about let's cost out, get the parliamentary budget officer, cost out all these inequalities, water, sanitation, child welfare, and fun stuff like recreation that every kid needs. And then let's create a Marshall Plan to address those inequalities, just like the Second World War. And then it says something else. It says, you know, the federal government needs to do better when it knows better. So there's something stopping it from implementing these many good solutions, like the Murdered Missing Indigenous Women and Girls Calls for Justice. So we need to find out, we need an independent evaluation of the government of Canada to find out what colonial remnants are stopping it from acting on the evidence. We talked about that report. We have translated all of these learning from the past things and how children get involved in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission into books, starring Spirit Bear, and we do them in French and English and also in First Nations languages. So Spirit Bear Echoes of the Past actually talks about monuments and how to deal with monuments, and also talks about residential school. All of these have free learning guides and they're available on our website. I'm going to skip by the embarrassed there. Here's the animated film that we've done on Jordan's Principle and on the tribunal. It's 23 minutes long. It's done by the amazing Spotted Fawn Productions, an Indigenous animation studio. So one of the things you could do, it's available on our website, free of charge this week. If you've got kids at home tomorrow, here's your sit down and watch Spirit Bear film, because it really shows how children of all diversities filled that courtroom. You know what was so interesting? When we started this case, adults were kind of freaked out about it. They thought, oh, there must be another side to this story. They're being too political. But little kids, when they started learning about residential schools in their classrooms, they could see clearly this was not fair. Why is it that these kids are getting less because they're First Nations? That's not fair. I'm going to go to the courtroom and I'm going to find out what's going on. And then they would take the added step of writing to the Prime Minister saying, look, you know, these kids deserve a proper education. So this is really a story back to the children, to inspire children, but also to inspire adults. So here's some documentaries you can watch. We Can't Make the Same Mistake Twice takes you right into the courtroom. You'll hear the government witnesses. You'll hear the First Nations witnesses. You'll see the trial unfold before your eyes. This, again, is free of charge. You can watch this tomorrow on the National Film Board website. And also, Jordan River Anderson, The Messenger, tells the full story of Jordan, his family, and the generous gift of Jordan's principal and the fight to get it there. That is a wonderful film. It's available free on the National Film Board's website for you to learn. And I close with this, with Dr. Bryce, who was forgotten about for over 100 years. One of the things that has happened over the years is that his grave has gone from only his family visiting him to the most visited grave in Beechwood Cemetery. We've worked with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, with historians, and with the Bryce family to put up a historical plaque honoring Dr. Bryce for what he did. And also, people from all walks of life, particularly First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, go to visit his grave and leave medicines, they leave letters to acknowledge this man and to say, we heard you when you said the work did not get done, and we're here to do it. He has a mailbox, and where you could write a letter of your commitment on the TRC's calls to action and send it to that mailbox. Now, this is, I was there today, and I actually opened the mailbox, and inside was a beautiful drawing by a child of a dog wearing a bright orange sweat shirt saying, I care. And isn't that really that's it, right? Isn't that all we have to do? We have to stop turning the page when we see these stories and think about, what is it that I can do right now in this moment to make the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action real? What can I do to make sure Joyce's principle is real? You know, that kid that I saw last week who was First Nations or Inuit, and they had that need. Maybe they didn't know about Jordan's principle. Maybe there's something that we can do about it. And then also, I think this is one guy that deserves to be in the Canadian Medical Hall of Fame. And we've actually nominated him, and he has not been selected. And for those of you who you may have heard, and I think it's fair to say about history, you know, there has been a charge against Bryce that he was into eugenics, but that's been disproven by multiple historians. And so here's a guy that should be in a Canadian Museum of Medicine. And also, there needs to be some more truth telling about some of these doctors, like Dr. Tisdale, who co-founded Pablum, but also conducted medical experiments on starving kids in residential schools. Okay? So I'm going to leave it there. This is how to get a hold of us. We really try to make everything free of charge available to people. We have 7 free ways for you to make a difference tomorrow. You could even do it after this call. It would only take you 2 minutes. And keep in mind that, you know, these little kids are really sacred. And they're getting hurt by government policy on our watch. We have the answers to deal with it. So the question is, are we going to finally get the work done? Thank you very much. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Cindy, for a very important and powerful talk. We already have a couple of questions and comments in the chat, so I'll start with those if you're ready.
Sure.
Give a couple of sips of water.
Yeah, thank you. This is and by the way, this is not beer. This This is my ginger ale.
Perfect, even better. So the first question, Dr. Sherwin, do Mitzi not qualify as status? Can they not access the services under Jordan's principle?
Right, so that's a very good question. The Indian Act only applies to First Nations, actually. You know, that's there are other types of discrimination that affect Métis that are separate from this, but because the federal government does not fund Métis services, at least not yet, hopefully it will under the Daniels decision, but they haven't acted on it. At this point, Jordan's principle does not apply to Métis children.
And Dr. Chen Tourneau would like to know, can we apply Jordan's principle to obtain services for a parent who is a caregiver of a child?
Yeah, make the case for the child. We've actually had, for example, we had a mom who was in late stages of her pregnancy, but had to remain on bed rest. And she had toddlers, right? So the support was for the mom, but also for the toddlers that help her care for the other kids. And that was approved under Jordan's principle. We had a mom who was losing her hearing. And so she needed to have her home refitted so that she could continue the care of her children. She was a loving mother. She just needed all of that kind of stuff that you need to be able to navigate that world. So that can be provided. Just make the link that this is necessary for that child to continue to grow up in a nurturing home.
And Dr. Pai wants to thank you for a brilliant and bold presentation. And she does hope that the RCS showcases Dr. Bryce's report.
Yeah, I do too.
And more power to you and your mission. That's from Dr. Pai, and I think from all of us. Dr. Diane, I think you sort of abridged this topic a little bit, but again, also thanks you for your timely and important talk. So she said, seems like child welfare starts with maternal welfare and education. Does Jordan's principle help pregnant individuals?
Right. You know, I think you could make the case that it does. We've certainly pressed for cases like that to get proper child and maternal health. Just make sure that you're saying like that really as a medical professional, you feel that this is going to be absolutely essential to that baby when they're born, this type of service. So again, link it to the baby when they're born. They may say no. If they say no, the decision can be appealed. And I think today's decision from the federal court makes it a lot harder for them to say no about a lot of stuff.
And Dr. Rosenblatt, wonderful presentations. Are the provinces helpful or harmful in the process? Since in general, the provinces that provide health services for non-First Nation individuals.
Right. One of the things that we need to do is really press the provinces, including Quebec, to adopt not only Joyce's principle, but Jordan's principle as well. And they've been kind of reluctant since this federal decision came down. They think, well, we can just leave the feds on the hook for it and not pick up the costs ourselves. But that's the whole problem again about leaving these kids in the gap. So some of the provinces are much more progressive, as you can imagine, than other provinces are. And they're in general quite uneven. What I would really like to see is kind of the funding for First Nations, Métis and Inuit children be driven towards those outcomes, having those communities do like we did, develop those well-being indicators, and then the provinces and federal government allocate the funding necessary to achieve those positive outcomes for kids. We're not there yet, but I'm hoping all of you are going to be joining in the effort to push these provinces more towards the finish line.
And from Dr. Rogers, thank you for your inspiring talk and specifically how empowering us with specific recommendations to help advocate for change. And from Dr. Sandy, are there talks to include children with disabilities after 18 years old, after the age of 18? Yeah.
Yeah, this is an excellent question. In fact, for those of you in Quebec, you'll remember the Vienne Commission. And the commissioner in there specifically recommends that the Jordan's principle be extended throughout the life course. The federal government's been resistant, but there was a legal case just filed in Manitoba that we are doing everything we can to support by families of children who, you know, literally were getting Jordan's principle help at day 17 and 364 and then are cut off the next day, right? Even though that young person's circumstances hasn't changed. So there is litigation against the Canadian government right now, but the Canadian government's position at the moment is that it stops at 18, at the age of majority. So that would be something we'd welcome advocacy from the medical community on, is pushing that so that children with disabilities or other needs, mental health needs, etc., are given the care they need. And I have, worked with brain scientists, etc., trying to educate the federal government on this whole idea of emerging adulthood, right? That really, these ages of majority are just really arbitrary. Like, people can prove this now, these medical professionals. You ought to be funding these services at least till 25 and likely beyond. But it's hard going.
And from Dr. Kaberi Dasgupta, a question to Dr. Rogers, Dr. Schifrin, and Dr. Eidelman. Could we send out a letter to Mr. Legault, on behalf of the department and faculty to ask for the adoption of Joyce's principles in Quebec, and faculty members we could sign? I think that's a great suggestion, Kaberi.
I second that, even though I'm not a faculty member. I see a question about the church.
Yeah.
Why hasn't the church acknowledged the systemic planned crime as genocide? That is a really good question. Canada, I think that, these groups are very reluctant to accept accountability. And they're often interested in reform everywhere. They use the word healing a lot for us. Oh, well, it's your job to heal. And I thought, what about your job? You're the repeat offender. You're the ones that did this. What about your healing work? Where's your reform? And I think they try to do that to deflect. That's the best reason I can come up with it. And I think the antidote to it, though, is for all of us to be laser focused onto these groups and saying, no, what I'm interested in is you have done this as an organization, and some of your members have, or who are currently alive. How are you going to be accountable? What did you learn from this horrible treatment of these children? How have you changed your organization so it won't happen again? And who's watching you to make sure it doesn't? That's really key, right? And we saw that with the statement of the bishops this week. Basically amounted to, we're sorry, we're going to raise $30 million. And my evaluation of that is, well, those sound like good words, but the elders have taught me integrity is when words have meaning. So the TRC calls to action is the Pope comes here to Canada to stand in one of those residential school grounds and apologizes here, not that a delegation goes over to Rome. And number two, that the church has got to reform itself so it stops these abuses to children, not just to residential schools, but in the sexual abuse scandals we've seen around the world.
And then a question from Dr. Khan. We continue to honor men who undertook racist actions and policies. Yet when we question whether to continue honoring them, some will respond with disdain, saying this is historical revisionism.
Yeah.
How would you respond to that?
I find that was such an interesting argument, often put forward by those who have never really studied the history. When you look back at history and you put those two players, Duncan Campbell Scott and Peter Henderson Bryce and Laurier, they were people at the same time in conversation with one another. You see that people back then knew better. I find what happens in a colonial history is they erase all the people that were raising the alarm. Even in Montreal, many of you know the Métis leader, Louis Riel. Well, of course, he led the Métis resistance. I don't call it rebellion, I call it resistance. And Johnny MacDonald rigged up a trial for him to make sure he was hung. He actually didn't use Canadian law for that. He used a 13th century British law and brought it into Canadian law to try this one guy and try and get him convicted for treason and hang him. And during that time, Johnny MacDonald is in the House of Commons and he delivers his speech, his notorious speech, and he says, "He shall hang," meaning Riel, "and every dog in Quebec shall bark." And what is he talking about? He's talking about the fact that there are literally tens of thousands of people in Quebec marching in protest against what the rigged trial of Louis Riel. So we have to go back and look at the people that were raising the alarm on these individuals back in the day. And also, like, for example, with Dr. Tisdale, I mean, here was a guy that was developing pablum to address nutritional issues. He had clear and convincing evidence of the malnutrition of these kids in residential schools. And instead of doing that, he deployed his skills to study how that malnutrition was affecting these children's bodies. So it's how they're deploying their professional skills unevenly that also counts.
And then there was a sort of a follow-up comment to what you've been saying. Has somebody mentioned that they weren't even taught about Riel in school, and that was 15 years ago now. So again, we have a lot of work to do there as well.
Yeah, I was taught that the Hudson Bay Company was so good. All the Indians did is bring in a bunch of furs and you got all this cool stuff. That was basically the whole module on the Hudson Bay Company.
So I think a lot of this looks at education here and a lot of education that has to continue across the board for sure. And there's another comment by Dr. Shergan to follow up on Dr. Kaberi, Dr. Dasgupta's request. Can our faculty reach out to healthcare providers working in Northern Quebec to have them join us in the petition to Premier Legault? So yes, definitely I can share it. So I work with the Cree Health Board and I can definitely share that with them. We have done something similar a couple of months ago, but again, the more petitions, the more we're out there, the more we continue. I think that the better that is for sure. And from Dr. Hings, do you think church is afraid apology will lead to legal and financial liability?
You know, there's a great saying that by not saying you're sorry and accepting responsibility, you actually create more liability. And I have a real life example from today's legal ruling. Had Canada accepted responsibility for underfunding these kids back in 2000, when they were sitting around the table and agreed they were underfunding them, and that was creating harms and separating their families, there would have been nobody to compensate because there would have been no victims, right? I find when you've messed up as a system, you ought to take full accountability. When you don't do that, you're actually going to make it worse and the amount much harder for yourself. But the real injustice is done to the harm that you continue to perpetrate on others. So I think it's fair that the church may do that. One of the things that the mayor of Nunavut did that was rather good, though, is he revoked the municipal tax exemption for the Catholic Church until they fulfill the TRC calls to action. So that would be good to see other municipalities fall in line with that.
And Dr. Rogers commented, advocacy is a CanMed's role that is central to being a specialist physician in Canada. So he's happy to advocate for Joseph's principle.
That's awesome. And add Jordan's principle on there too. So,
yeah.
For Legault.
And Dr. Rosenblatt says, you spoke about costing of all reforms for proper parliamentary process. Have the First Nations done the costing?
We've done it a lot in individual programs, but what we're hoping to do is get all of the inequalities done. So one of the areas that, for example, that needs more work is juvenile justice. So there has not been, for example, a parliamentary budget officer report on that, or an auditor general's report, or a real concentrated First Nations report on what is needed to be able to keep young people out of the criminal justice system and support those young people who are in there in better ways. So that's an area like of an example that needs more work. But we've done quite a bit on early childhood education, on child welfare, of course. There's been some work on health. I'd like to see a lot more work on dentistry, on dental health and oral health and that kind of area.
And I think one last comment by Dr. Pai, which I think is very appropriate to end on. Mahatma Gandhi said, truth can stand naked, but a lie needs to be dressed. Mm-hmm. So I think it's time to be truthful to end racism here.
Yeah, and if you have a chance, read that federal court decision. I think the federal judge came to the same conclusion.
All right, so I think it's 6 p.m. So if there's any other comments or anything else like this, otherwise, thank you so much, Cindy. Again, on behalf of everybody here, it was a wonderful talk and it was very inspiring.
Well,
thank you so much.
Thank you. And I hope you all wear an orange shirt today. And just for those of you who don't know, the reason that we wear orange is because Phyllis Webstad, who is a little girl going to her first day of school, her granny made her a beautiful orange shirt to wear on that very special day. Unfortunately for Phyllis, it was a residential school. And one of the first things they did is gave her a number and took away her name and took away her orange shirt. So find something beautifully bright orange tomorrow. Or even if you don't, get out an orange marker and just color a little orange shirt and pin it to your lapel. So have a great day, everyone.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Bye.